Thanks again, Tracy. Ambassador Fernandez, as we just heard from Cardinal Rai, Lebanon currently finds itself on the brink of social and economic collapse, forcing a growing number of Lebanese Christians to leave Lebanon and immigrate west. The Patriarch has been championing this idea of active neutrality to address Lebanon's political and economic problems. Ambassador, what would it take to achieve this active neutrality in the region, considering the fact that Hezbollah currently wields a significant amount of military might in the country, which is anything but neutral?
Well, it's very difficult. We are in a situation where you basically have had 15 years of growing Hezbollah hegemony over the country, over the state, the deep state, over the political class. And so you have two things happening. You have a humanitarian economic crisis, which is obviously should be a priority for everyone. I mean, there are suffering people. The people of Lebanon have been impoverished seemingly overnight. But you have a political military crisis, and that's where Hezbollah comes in. There is a way to do this. It's not an easy way. It's not a pretty way to try to kind of implement the vision of the Cardinal, of the Patriarch, and of many other Lebanese Muslims and Christians. What you need to do is kind of get down into the weeds, get your hands dirty, and basically play the cold realpolitik game of where you are supporting and funding and helping enemies of Hezbollah. This is what they do with their allies. They support them, they fund them, they encourage them, they locate them. There is no other kind of balancing act on the other side that can push against kind of this Hezbollah hegemony. And what you need to kind of be able to move towards a neutral Lebanon, a Lebanon disengaged from the passions of the region, you need some kind of equilibrium. So you need to play that kind of political ground game. It's deeply political. It's a cynical game that has to be played behind the scenes, quietly, ruthlessly. At the same time, you have this humanitarian crisis where there are people who are suffering and who need help. They need help to be able to keep Lebanese Christians and non-Christians tied to the land. So you have probably one of the most diabolical, one of the most difficult dilemmas in the world, because you have a massive humanitarian crisis occurring, which needs urgent attention. It cannot be delayed. And you have an extremely delicate and potentially extremely violent political process, which needs to be managed and needs to be managed to push Hezbollah away from having all of the levers of power. All too often, what we've been able to do is talk about the first thing, about the humanitarian crisis, and kind of ignore the deep political game that needs to be played. Not empowering Hezbollah's enablers and collaborators. That's what we've been doing for years. But to raise up a generation of opponents, of real opponents, and empower them.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned the humanitarian disaster that occurred just last month on the 4th of August in the port of Beirut. We have a question that comes in to us from Father Alfred Badawi from Detroit, Michigan. He asks a similar question. He asks, as Christians, as Americans, where do we stand after the August 4th disaster in Beirut? What can we do? We don't want to bolster a corrupt government, but there's clearly a disaster that occurred, intense or incredible human suffering. How do we respond as Christians and Americans?
Well, I would say, first of all, Lebanon's disaster, the explosion of August 4th epitomizes it. But the catastrophe or the disaster that I'm referring to actually began much, much earlier. And this is kind of the economic, social collapse of the country, which has just been made worse by the explosion. I think what Christians can do is to think small, is to look at helping micro level institutions, organizations, individuals, churches, businesses, small businesses, and others. That's what you need to do.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to take this opportunity to shift over to Robert Nicholson. Robert, just last week, President Trump hosted the official signing of the Abraham Accords, in which the UAE and Bahrain normalized relations with Israel. Robert, how do you view these accords to pertain specifically to Christians of the Middle East?
Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you, IDC. It's always great to be together, to partner. We're very grateful at Philos for all that IDC does. As my fellow panelists have said, it's truly one of a kind organization. It's a great question, and I think that for many people, there's not an immediate connection, right? There are not all that many Christians in either Israel or Bahrain or the UAE. However, I think this is a watershed. I think it is certainly the most important development for pluralism in the last quarter century. And I think that Christians, although not directly implicated, will indirectly reap the benefits. And that's for a few reasons. First of all, I think that these deals, first of all, just prove that people of all faiths across the region, Jews, Christians, Muslims, others, want a peaceful future. And for the last 20, 25 years, it has not necessarily been clear that that's true. This proves that people want peace. It also proves that old paradigms can change. Rules can change. New ideas can break out. New relationships can be formed. This surprised many people, but there is something here that opens the door for all kinds of other new developments. Of course, in a more practical sense, these deals strengthen the alliance, the security alliance, the political alliance against those states and axes that are threatening Christians, the real threats. We talked about Iran and its proxies. We talk about Turkish aggression. These deals also create a platform for Jewish-Muslim cooperation on behalf of Christians inside Israel and inside the Palestinian territories. Last of all, I think these deals prove that American leadership matters. I think for the last 20 years, we've seen lots and lots of missteps on the part of US administrations from both sides. And what we see here is that America actually still can do good things in the region when it makes a decision and goes for it. There's plenty that still needs to be done. These deals are not perfect, but this is absolutely a great start. And I think the benefits, as I said, will accrue to the Christian account in time.
Thank you, Robert. We actually have a question sent in from one of our viewers. I'll give it to you, Robert. She asks, as the Philos Project, that's your organization, Robert, that you lead, how do you see the goal of religious pluralism in the Middle East? And how does Philos move toward this goal? And how can we help? Real briefly.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people want everyone to get together and hug. And if you work in this region for 5 minutes, you know that that's not the easiest thing to do. What I think the basis for pluralism is mutual respect. We don't need to become all one religion, all one group. The enemy in the region are those forces that want everyone to be the same. Pluralism begins with an affirmation that difference is okay. And so we do all kinds of programs at Philos, but a lot of them come down to bringing people from different backgrounds into the same room to talk about the differences they have, but also about the ways that they can work together despite those differences. It's a simple concept, but I think it's the most useful one for achieving some measure of pluralism in the near future.
Thanks, Robert. Shifting our attention over to Iraq, Commissioner Maenza, as a result of the ISIS genocide of Christians in 2014, 2015, there has been a mass exodus of Christians from the Nineveh Plain and northern Iraq in general. What are some of the current security concerns hampering their safe return now that ISIS is no longer a threat? And how is this best addressed?
Right. So right now, the Nineveh Plains in Iraq is overrun with Iran-backed militias. They're also called Hashishabi, Popular Mobilization Forces, Popular Mobilization Unit. It can get a little confusing. But they continue, as you said, to be a barrier to the free movement and the safe return of Christians and Yazidis to the Nineveh Plains. So these militias are not like the militias we're used to in the United States, and they're not like self-organized per se. These folks are paid a salary by the Iraqi government, yet they mostly take their orders from Iran. Yeah, and we give a lot of money to Iraq. So it's a very complicated situation. When I was in the Nineveh Plains last year, I saw pictures of the Ayatollah Khomeini everywhere. I saw, Hashishabi flags flying higher than the Iraq flag. I went through 11 checkpoints. that are impossible for Christians and Yazidis to pass through. And so, the U.S. government has sanctioned 2 of these militia leaders for crimes against Christians and other religious minorities, or components, as they prefer to be called, because this is a really impossible situation for Christians. So USCIRF has recommended that the U.S. government pressure the Iraqi government to implement its own stated policy to rein in the militias. We know that that's not an easy thing to do, but at the end of the day, we can rebuild houses and infrastructure and provide humanitarian support. But if we cannot provide security for Christians, if they cannot be really, at the end of the day, be a part of their own local governance and local security, if they're not a part of both of those things, they're not going to stay. And so this transition isn't going to be an easy one. The Prime Minister is going to need a lot of support for protection. But at some point in time, it's going to have to be done, or we're just going to keep talking about this year after year. So I'm really praying that the Lord will open the door for Christians to be able to continue to live in their homeland.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I want to thank you all, our panelists, for being with us tonight. I want to thank you for your support, for your partnership, and for taking the time to join us this evening. Tracy?